For almost 30 years, the Kristin Smart case existed in a strange place between memory and silence. Everyone knew the name. Everyone knew the story. A college student disappears after a party. No body, no confession, no clear ending. And over time, something dangerous started happening. People began treating the case like history, like something frozen in the past, a mystery that belonged to another generation, until investigators returned to a house in California and found something that changed everything again. Not a rumor, not an anonymous tip online. Real forensic work, ground-penetrating radar, soil testing, search teams. The kind of activity that tells the public one thing immediately: law enforcement believes there may still be answers hidden underground. That is what pulled this case back into national attention. Because when detectives return after 3 decades, they usually return for a reason. And in the Kristin Smart investigation, every return carries weight. Because this case was never just about a disappearance, it became something much larger. A story about missed opportunities, about suspicion without resolution, about how someone can remain at the center of a murder investigation for decades without ever fully escaping it. To understand why this new search matters, you have to go back to the beginning. May 25, 1996. California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. Kristin Smart was 19 years old, tall, friendly, known for standing out in a crowd because of her height and personality. That weekend, the campus was celebrating Memorial Day. Parties everywhere, students moving between houses, music, alcohol. The kind of night that feels normal until one moment changes everything. Kristin attended an off-campus party near Crandall Way. Witnesses later described her as heavily intoxicated, unsteady, having trouble walking. That detail matters, because vulnerability changes timelines. At some point during the night, several students began helping her back toward her dorm. One of those students was Paul Flores. That name would become attached to this case permanently. Not because police immediately solved the crime, because his name never left the investigation after that night. Witnesses later said Flores insisted on helping Kristin walk home. One student described Kristin barely able to keep herself upright. Another remembered Flores staying unusually close to her. Eventually, the group separated. Students returned to their dorms. Kristin and Paul continued walking. And then something happened in the darkness between the party and her residence hall. Something nobody saw clearly. Something that has haunted this case for nearly 30 years. Because Kristin Smart was never seen again. At first, people assumed she would turn up. College students disappear for a day sometimes, stay with friends, miss class, sleep somewhere else. But Kristin's disappearance began feeling wrong almost immediately. She missed important commitments. Her belongings remained untouched. Friends could not reach her. And then came the detail investigators still mentioned decades later. Her car was still parked near campus. Everything about the situation suggested interruption, not voluntary disappearance. The investigation started quickly. But almost from the beginning, there were problems, missteps, delayed searches, lost opportunities. The kind of early mistakes that become devastating later. Because in missing person investigations, the first 48 hours matter more than almost anything else. And once those hours pass, evidence changes. Witness memory changes. Scenes change. People have time to prepare. That reality hangs over the Kristin Smart case even now. Because many investigators believe the best chance to solve the case existed in those first days. And those days were chaotic. Paul Flores immediately drew attention, not officially at first, but socially. People noticed his behavior. Witnesses said he had scratches on his body after the night Kristin disappeared. A black eye, inconsistent explanations. At one point, he reportedly told different stories about how he got injured. That matters, not because injuries prove guilt, because changing explanations create pressure. Pressure creates scrutiny. And scrutiny followed him for decades. Cadaver dogs later alerted near his dorm room. Another major moment, not proof, but enough to deepen suspicion. The problem was that suspicion and evidence are not the same thing. Investigators needed something stronger, something physical, something undeniable. And for years, they did not have it. The case slowly transformed into one of the most famous unsolved disappearances in California history. Billboards, podcasts, television specials, public frustration, Kristin's family refusing to stop searching. That persistence became one of the defining parts of the story, because some families eventually lose public attention. The Smart family never allowed that to happen. They kept pressure alive, kept asking questions, kept forcing people to remember. And memory matters in cold cases, because cold cases survive on pressure. Without pressure, investigations fade. With pressure, investigators keep digging. And digging is exactly what eventually brought this case back to life. Over the years, law enforcement returned again and again to one place: the Flores family properties. Search warrants, excavations, ground scans, dogs. Every return carried the same unspoken message. Investigators believed Kristin's body had once been there, maybe still was. That belief intensified when modern forensic technology improved. Because evidence hidden in 1996 does not necessarily stay hidden forever. Soil changes. Biological material leaves traces. Ground disturbances remain detectable. Technology gets better. And time, strangely enough, can sometimes help investigators instead of hurting them. That possibility exploded again when recent searches focused on soil evidence beneath a deck at one of the Flores properties. Forensic teams reportedly detected signs consistent with decomposition. Human blood evidence, disturbance patterns, enough to convince investigators something significant may have happened there. That detail reignited everything. Because if Kristin's remains had once been buried there, then someone moved them. And if someone moved them, then someone has been protecting that secret for nearly 30 years. That is what makes this case so disturbing. Not only the disappearance, the silence afterward, the idea that people may have known more than they ever admitted. And that possibility is where this story becomes far larger than one missing college student. Because this is no longer just a mystery about what happened in 1996. It is a story about what people are willing to hide for decades. As the years passed, the Kristin Smart case stopped feeling like a normal investigation. It became something heavier, a shadow hanging over an entire community, because everyone seemed to know the same thing, but nobody could fully prove it. That kind of case changes people, especially in a college town. Students graduated, faculty changed, new people moved into San Luis Obispo. But the story stayed. A missing 19-year-old girl, a suspect whose name never disappeared, and a family that refused to stop asking where their daughter was. For investigators, the problem was not suspicion. There was plenty of that. The problem was evidence strong enough to survive court. Because prosecutors cannot build murder cases on rumors, they need physical proof, or a confession, or witnesses willing to connect the final pieces. And for years, none of those pieces fully existed. Still, Paul Flores remained at the center of everything. Not officially charged, not convicted, but always there. Always connected to the timeline. Always connected to the last known moments of Kristin's life. Witnesses from that night became incredibly important. One student remembered seeing Flores walking Kristin toward the dorms. Another recalled her struggling to stay upright. A third remembered Flores acting strangely afterward. Individually, these details were limited. Together they created a pattern. And patterns matter in cold cases. Because cold cases are rarely solved by one dramatic breakthrough. They are solved when small details begin aligning after years of pressure. That pressure intensified as journalists and independent investigators began revisiting the case. Podcasts changed everything, especially one. Your Own Backyard. The podcast pulled millions of people back into the investigation. Not with sensationalism, with detail, timelines, interviews, forgotten inconsistencies, and something important happened after it gained attention. People started talking again. Witnesses who stayed quiet for years began revisiting memories. New tips came in. Old information resurfaced. That matters because cold cases often depend on renewed public attention. Time changes people. Someone afraid in 1996 may speak in 2026. Someone loyal may no longer feel loyal. Someone protecting a secret may become exhausted by carrying it. Investigators understand this. That is why they never fully close cases like Kristin's, because silence weakens over time. Eventually, somebody talks. And when enough pressure builds, even families connected to suspects begin feeling it. That is what happened around the Flores family. Search warrants became more aggressive. Properties were examined multiple times. Cadaver dogs reportedly alerted near locations tied to the family. Neighbors described strange behavior over the years. Stories began surfacing about trailers being moved late at night. Disturbed ground, concrete work. The kind of details that sound ordinary alone, but unsettling when attached to a missing person investigation. Then came one of the biggest turning points in the case. Investigators used ground-penetrating radar beneath a deck at the Flores property in Arroyo Grande. What they found changed the direction of everything. Reports described a large soil disturbance, possible evidence of decomposition, human blood evidence detected in the ground. Forensic experts believed a body may once have been buried there. That detail shook the case nationally, because it suggested something investigators had suspected for decades. Kristin Smart may have been hidden on that property. But there was another terrifying implication too. If she had once been there, and was no longer there, someone moved her. Which means someone had decades to think about evidence, decades to prepare, decades to remain silent. That possibility transformed the case from tragic to chilling, because it suggested active concealment across generations. Investigators eventually arrested Paul Flores, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, the case finally moved toward trial. That moment mattered enormously, not just for the Smart family, for everyone who had watched the case sit unresolved for decades, because many cold cases never reach that point. They stay frozen forever. Kristin's case didn't. But the trial brought another painful reality. Even after 30 years, there was still no body, no confirmed recovery, no final physical location investigators could present in court. That absence became central, because defense attorneys focused on it immediately. No body, no direct forensic link to murder, no eyewitness to the crime itself. The prosecution had to build something else instead, a circumstantial case so strong it formed a complete picture. And circumstantial evidence, despite what television teaches people, can be incredibly powerful, especially when every piece points in the same direction. Witness testimony, behavior, search history, dog alerts, soil evidence, statements over the years, all of it forming one consistent narrative. The prosecution argued Paul Flores attempted to rape Kristin Smart after walking her home and killed her during the encounter. Then came the concealment, the years of silence, the movement of remains, the protection surrounding the secret. That theory matched what investigators had privately believed for decades. But courtrooms require more than belief. They require persuasion. And this case would test exactly how much circumstantial evidence a jury was willing to accept. The trial became emotionally exhausting, especially for Kristin's family, because every detail forced them back into 1996, back into uncertainty, back into the final night their daughter was alive. But something else happened during the proceedings too. Public opinion hardened, because people listening to the timeline began recognizing something disturbing. The behavior after Kristin disappeared often seemed more revealing than the disappearance itself. Inconsistent statements, lack of concern, changing explanations, silence. And silence in cases like this becomes its own kind of evidence. Not legally, psychologically, because innocent people usually want resolution. Guilty people often want confusion. That difference matters. And by the time the trial was underway, many believed the confusion surrounding Kristin Smart had lasted nearly 30 years for a reason. The question was no longer whether investigators suspected Paul Flores. Everyone knew they did. The question became something much darker. How many people helped keep the secret alive? By the time the trial began, the Kristin Smart case was no longer only about one missing college student. It had become a story about time, about what time hides, what it erases, and what it strangely preserves. Because even after 26 years, investigators were still uncovering things connected to the night Kristin disappeared. Not direct answers. Fragments. But fragments matter in cold cases. Cold cases are built from fragments. And one of the most important fragments in this investigation was behavior. Not just Paul Flores' behavior the night Kristin vanished. The behavior afterward. Because investigators believe the aftermath of a crime often reveals more than the crime itself. How someone reacts, what they avoid, what they explain before being asked. Those things matter. Witnesses described Flores acting strangely after Kristin disappeared. He reportedly appeared nervous, agitated, at times unusually interested in the investigation itself. Again, none of those things prove murder. But when combined with everything else, they create pressure. Pressure that followed him for decades. The prosecution focused heavily on that pattern, not because they had a body, because they had continuity, a timeline where suspicion never meaningfully moved away from one person. That is rare. Most cold cases drift, new suspects appear, theories expand. Kristin Smart's case stayed centered. From 1996 onward, the same name remained attached to the story. And that consistency became powerful in court. The jury heard testimony about Flores walking Kristin home, about him being the final person seen with her, about the injuries he reportedly displayed afterward, about his changing explanations. And then came the forensic evidence connected to the Flores family property. That evidence became one of the most chilling aspects of the entire trial. Because forensic experts described soil beneath the deck as showing signs consistent with decomposition, human blood evidence, disturbed earth, patterns that investigators argued were consistent with a buried body. Even more disturbing, the evidence suggested the remains may have later been removed. That detail changes everything psychologically. Because temporary burial implies planning after the crime, movement, concealment, possibly assistance. The prosecution argued exactly that Kristin was buried beneath the deck for years before being moved. And if that happened, it means someone spent decades living above that secret, walking across it. Knowing exactly what was underneath, that image stayed with people following the case, because it transforms the story from a college disappearance into something far darker, a hidden grave beneath ordinary life. The defense attacked the forensic interpretation aggressively. They argued there was no confirmed body, no definitive DNA identification from remains, no direct physical proof Kristin had been buried there. That is the challenge with cold cases. Time destroys clarity, evidence fades, and prosecutors must convince juries using accumulation instead of certainty. But accumulation can be incredibly persuasive, especially when every detail keeps pointing back to the same person. Then came another major issue. Electronic surveillance. Investigators had secretly recorded conversations involving Flores years earlier. At one point, authorities placed listening devices in vehicles connected to the family. That tactic showed something important. Investigators believed people close to Paul Flores might eventually say something incriminating privately, because in long-running cases, families often become pressure points. Secrets become exhausting, and exhaustion creates mistakes. The recordings reportedly revealed tension, careful language, people avoiding direct discussion, not dramatic confessions, but enough to deepen suspicion. That is another reality of cold cases. Sometimes what people avoid saying becomes more important than what they actually say. Because avoidance signals awareness. Awareness signals fear. And fear usually exists for a reason. As the trial continued, Kristin's family sat through every painful detail, every timeline, every witness, every reminder that their daughter never came home after that party in 1996. That emotional weight shaped the courtroom. Because unlike fictional crime stories, real cases do not reset between episodes. Families carry every year of uncertainty with them. Birthdays, holidays, aging without answers. That kind of pain changes people permanently. And for the Smart family, the trial represented something they waited nearly 3 decades to see. Movement. Not closure. Movement. Because even a trial cannot restore what was taken. It can only establish responsibility. Still, many people watching the case believed the investigation pointed towards something larger. Not just one man, potentially multiple people helping conceal the truth over time. That theory grew stronger because of the alleged movement of remains. Bodies do not relocate themselves. And moving remains years later requires knowledge, planning, possibly assistance. That possibility remains one of the darkest parts of the case, because it suggests the silence surrounding Kristin Smart may not have belonged to one person alone. Investigators never publicly solved every question surrounding the movement of remains. And that uncertainty continues haunting the case even now, because although prosecutors built a powerful narrative, one devastating reality remains unchanged. Kristin Smart's body has never officially been recovered. That absence matters deeply. Not only legally, emotionally. Because families need somewhere to grieve, somewhere real. And without that, the case never fully settles. It remains unfinished in a human sense. That unfinished feeling is exactly why every new search connected to this case becomes national news, especially now. Especially after recent forensic activity reignited fears, investigators may still believe Kristin's remains are hidden somewhere connected to the Flores family. And if that belief is correct, then after nearly 30 years, this story may still be evolving. Because some secrets survive for decades, until one mistake finally exposes them. As the prosecution continued laying out its case, one theme kept returning again and again. Control. Not just control during the crime, control after it. Control over information, control over silence, control over what investigators could and could not prove. Because for nearly 3 decades, the Kristin Smart case existed in a strange balance. Investigators appeared convinced. The public largely believed they knew who was responsible. And yet, legally, the case remained incomplete. That balance created enormous frustration, especially for Kristin's family. Because suspicion without accountability becomes its own kind of punishment. You know where attention is focused. You know who investigators keep returning to. But unless prosecutors can cross the final legal line, nothing changes. That is why the forensic evidence beneath the deck mattered so much. Not because it solved everything, because it transformed the case from theory into physical possibility. The prosecution argued the disturbed soil beneath the Flores property was not accidental, not landscaping, not natural shifting. Experts testified that the patterns were consistent with a body having decomposed there over time. Human blood evidence reinforced that conclusion. That testimony became one of the emotional centers of the trial. Because for the first time, investigators were not just suggesting Kristin may have been harmed. They were describing where she may have been hidden. That distinction matters.
It changes how a jury sees the case, and it changes how the public feels about the silence surrounding it. The defense responded aggressively. They argued decomposition science is not perfect, that soil staining can be interpreted differently, that without confirmed remains, prosecutors were asking the jury to assume too much, and legally, that argument matters.
Because criminal convictions require certainty beyond reasonable doubt, not emotional certainty, legal certainty. The prosecution understood that, which is why they built the case around accumulation. Witnesses.
Behavior, forensics, movement, statements over time. Everything forming one direction, one narrative, one explanation more consistent than any other. And the jury had to decide whether that explanation was enough. While that battle played out in court, another detail from the past kept resurfacing. The black eye. The scratches. The injuries Paul Flores reportedly displayed shortly after Kristin vanished. Witnesses described him, explaining them differently to different people. That matters enormously in investigations, because changing explanations create psychological pressure. An innocent explanation usually remains stable. False explanations adapt, and adaptation becomes visible over time, especially across decades. The prosecution highlighted those inconsistencies repeatedly, not as proof by themselves, but as part of a larger pattern. A pattern where almost every road eventually circled back to the same person. Then came testimony surrounding the cadaver dogs. Years earlier, dogs reportedly alerted near Flores's dorm room. That evidence was controversial. Dog alerts alone cannot convict someone. But emotionally, they carry weight. Because cadaver dogs are trained specifically for one thing: the scent of human decomposition. The prosecution used those alerts carefully, not as final proof, as another fragment supporting the same narrative investigators had followed since 1996. Again and again, the case returned to the same idea. Kristin Smart reached the area near her dorm. Paul Flores was with her, and after that, she disappeared forever. No verified sightings, no financial activity, no communication, nothing. That kind of disappearance is extremely rare, especially for a 19-year-old with strong family connections and future plans. Investigators argued voluntary disappearance simply did not fit reality. And over time, fewer and fewer people believed it did. The podcast attention changed public perception dramatically too. Your Own Backyard transformed the case from a regional mystery into a national obsession. Millions listened. Millions heard the timelines, the witness accounts, the inconsistencies, and public pressure intensified again. That matters more than people realize, because cold cases often move when attention returns. Pressure creates movement. Movement creates mistakes. And mistakes create openings investigators can use. Some investigators privately admitted the renewed attention likely helped push the case forward, because people who stayed silent for years suddenly found themselves revisiting memories they had buried. And memory, even imperfect memory, becomes valuable in long investigations, especially when multiple memories align. As the trial neared its conclusion, one horrifying reality became impossible to ignore. If prosecutors were correct, then Kristin Smart may have spent years buried beneath that deck while normal life continued above her. Family gatherings, conversations, routine, all happening over hidden remains. That image disturbed people deeply, because it turns ordinary domestic space into something sinister. A backyard, a deck, a normal suburban property, and underneath it, according to investigators, evidence of one of California's most infamous unsolved killings. That contrast is what gives the case its emotional weight. Normal life covering something terrible. The same theme appears in many major true crime cases. But few lasted this long. Few carried this level of public frustration. And few left a family waiting this many years for basic answers. Eventually, after decades of investigation, the jury reached its decision. Paul Flores was convicted of Kristin Smart's murder. For the Smart family, it was a historic moment. Not victory. There is no victory in cases like this. But acknowledgement. A legal statement that Kristin did not simply disappear. That something criminal happened to her, that someone was responsible. And yet, even after the conviction, one devastating reality remained unchanged. Kristin still had not come home. No confirmed recovery. No burial. No final place for the family to visit. Which means that even after 30 years, one final question still remains unanswered. Where is Kristin Smart now? And that question may be exactly why investigators recently returned to searching again. Because some cases do not truly end with conviction. They end only when the missing finally come home. For many families, a conviction would be the end of the story. In the Kristin Smart case, it was. Because even after Paul Flores was found guilty of murder, the most important thing was still missing. Kristin herself. No confirmed remains. No final recovery. No grave. Nothing the family could truly bring home. That changes everything emotionally. Because convictions create accountability. But recoveries create reality. Without a recovery, part of the story always remains suspended. Unfinished. And that unfinished feeling is exactly why investigators continue searching even now. That is what makes the recent developments so significant. Because law enforcement does not spend major resources revisiting old properties without reason. Especially after a conviction. At that stage, searches are no longer about proving guilt. They are about finding truth. Finding remains. Finding whatever was still hidden. Recent reports surrounding renewed forensic testing shocked people following the case. Ground scans. Soil analysis. New examinations connected to locations tied to the Flores family. The activity suggested something critical. Investigators may still believe Kristin's remains were moved. That possibility changes how the entire case is understood. Because moving remains years later requires awareness, planning, access, possibly assistance. And if multiple people helped protect that secret over time, then the silence surrounding Kristin's disappearance becomes even darker than many originally imagined. Some investigators believe the original burial site may have become risky after public attention intensified. Media pressure, search warrants, dog alerts, all of that increases fear for anyone hiding evidence, which creates motive to relocate remains. That theory has existed for years, but recent forensic interest made people believe investigators may now have stronger reasons to take it seriously. The Smart family has lived through every stage of that uncertainty. Hope, disappointment, searches, false leads, court victories that still did not answer the final question. That kind of emotional exhaustion changes families permanently. Because cold cases are different from sudden tragedy. Cold cases stretch grief across decades. Every birthday becomes a reminder. Every holiday reopens the timeline. And every new search forces the family emotionally back into the original moment. Back into 1996. Back into the night Kristin never came home. That emotional reality is easy for the public to overlook. People consume cases in episodes. Families live them continuously. And the Kristin Smart case became one of the clearest examples of how time itself becomes part of the punishment. Especially when silence survives for this long. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case remains the possibility that multiple people knew more than they admitted. Investigators never publicly established a complete conspiracy, but they repeatedly focused attention on behavior surrounding the Flores family over the years. The searches, The alleged movement of evidence. The careful avoidance in recorded conversations. All of it created a lingering sense that the truth may have been protected, not merely hidden. That possibility haunted public perception. Because one person committing violence is horrifying enough. But silence shared across years feels different. It feels colder, more deliberate. And that is why people remain obsessed with this case decades later. Not only because Kristin disappeared, because the disappearance appeared survivable, solvable, close enough to understand, and yet somehow it remained unresolved for nearly 30 years. That contradiction frustrates people deeply, especially when the timeline itself feels so narrow. A college party, a walk home, one final known companion. Then nothing. No verified sightings. No contact. No evidence Kristin ever started a new life anywhere else. The prosecution emphasized that repeatedly during trial. Voluntary disappearance made no sense. Not for Kristin. Not for her relationships. Not for her future plans. Everything pointed toward interruption. Permanent interruption. The conviction finally established that legally. But legal acknowledgement is not emotional completion. The Smart family still does not know where Kristin rests. And investigators may still be chasing that answer even now. That possibility exploded back into public attention when recent reports described renewed forensic interest around former Flores properties. The details reignited national media coverage immediately, because people understood what it could mean. If investigators are searching again after all these years, they may believe there is still something left to find. And if there is, then the Kristin Smart case may not actually be finished yet. Not emotionally, not forensically, possibly not even investigatively. That is why this case continues haunting California, because it represents something larger than one disappearance. It represents what happens when early investigative mistakes collide with decades of silence. Many experts believe the first days after Kristin vanished were mishandled. Critical opportunities lost. Searches delayed. Potential evidence compromised. Those criticisms followed the case for years. And they matter because cold cases are often shaped less by what investigators eventually discover than by what they failed to preserve at the beginning. That reality frustrates many people connected to the case, because they believe answers may have existed early on. Answers that time eventually buried. But time does not bury everything. Sometimes it preserves enough. Enough soil evidence. Enough witness memory. Enough behavioral patterns. Enough persistence from a family unwilling to stop asking questions. And persistence may be the real reason this case survived long enough to reach conviction at all. Because without Kristin's family, many believe the investigation might have faded permanently. Instead, it stayed alive. Year after year. Surge after surge. Until eventually, the pressure became too strong to ignore. And now, nearly 30 years later, investigators appear to believe there may still be one final piece hidden somewhere. One final location. One final truth waiting underground. The longer the Kristin Smart case continued, the more it transformed from a criminal investigation into something almost symbolic. Because for many people, this case stopped representing only one victim. It became a symbol of every cold case where families spend decades waiting for answers. Every investigation where everyone suspects the same thing. But proof takes years to catch up. And in Kristin's case, proof came slowly, painfully slowly, not through one dramatic discovery, but through accumulation. Witnesses, patterns, soil evidence, behavior, every piece adding weight until the silence surrounding the case finally collapsed. But even after the conviction, another question remained impossible to ignore. Could this have been solved much earlier? That question has followed the investigation for years, especially because so many warning signs appeared immediately after Kristin disappeared. Paul Flores was reportedly the last person seen with her. Witnesses described Kristin heavily intoxicated and vulnerable. Dog alerts occurred near his dorm room. He appeared with unexplained injuries afterward. And still, decades passed before a conviction happened. That timeline frustrates many investigators, because early momentum matters enormously in homicide cases. The first days after a disappearance often contain the clearest evidence investigators will ever have. Scenes remain untouched. Memories remain fresh. People have less time to coordinate stories. Once that window closes, cases become exponentially harder. And many experts believe the Kristin Smart investigation suffered from exactly that problem. Critical delays, missed urgency, an early failure to fully recognize what the case actually was. Because at first, there were still people treating Kristin as a possible runaway, a voluntary disappearance. That assumption slowed everything. And in retrospect, many believe it cost investigators valuable time. That frustration became part of the public conversation around the case, especially after newer generations discovered the story through podcasts and documentaries. People listening decades later often had the same reaction. How did this go unsolved for so long? The answer is complicated. Because cold cases survive when evidence survives. And evidence, in this case, was deeply fragmented. No body, no direct eyewitness to murder, no confession for decades. What investigators had instead was persistence. And persistence can sometimes overcome missing evidence, especially when technology improves. Ground-penetrating radar became one of the most important tools in the later investigation. Modern soil analysis became another, because the earth itself remembers disturbance. Burials leave patterns. Biological decomposition changes chemistry. Time alters landscapes, but not perfectly. And forensic science keeps evolving. That evolution may be one of the biggest reasons the case finally reached conviction. Evidence that meant little in 1996 became more meaningful decades later. That is a terrifying thought in its own way, because it suggests some killers escape, not because they are smarter than investigators, but because technology has not caught up yet. Eventually, though, it often does. And when it does, old crimes suddenly become visible again. The Flores property searches became central to that visibility. Each search reignited attention. Each warrant told the public the same thing. Investigators still believed evidence connected to Kristin existed there. That repeated focus mattered psychologically, because innocent people usually welcome finality. This case never reached finality. The searches kept returning. Again, and again, and again. That repetition shaped public perception powerfully, especially once forensic experts testified about decomposition evidence beneath the deck. Because ordinary people understand what that implies immediately. Someone may have been buried there. And if someone was buried there, someone knew. That is the part many people struggle with emotionally. The possibility of knowledge surviving quietly inside a family for decades. The possibility of ordinary life continuing above hidden remains. Birthdays, dinners, conversations, routine, all happening while one secret stayed underground. That image haunted the trial, and it continues haunting the public even now, because it turns silence into something active, not accidental forgetting, intentional concealment. The prosecution argued exactly that after Kristin's death, concealment became the priority. Not panic, not remorse, protection. Protection of freedom, protection of family, protection of a secret that eventually consumed nearly 30 years. That theory explains why the case feels so psychologically heavy. Not just because of what happened to Kristin, because of what allegedly happened afterward. The years of avoidance, the years of denial, the years where her family waited while others stayed silent. That silence becomes almost impossible to forgive emotionally, even when legal accountability finally arrives. And legal accountability did arrive. Paul Flores was convicted. But another devastating truth remains. Kristin Smart is still missing. Legally dead. Emotionally absent. Physically unrecovered. Which means the case still feels unfinished in the most important way. That unfinished feeling is exactly why recent searches created so much national attention. People understand what those searches represent. Hope. Maybe fragile hope. But hope nonetheless. Hope that after nearly 30 years, investigators may still find the final piece. The final location. The final truth. And if they do, then this story may change one last time. Because cold cases rarely end with the conviction people imagine. Sometimes the real ending comes later, when the missing finally come home. As investigators continued revisiting evidence connected to the Kristin Smart case, one reality became impossible to ignore. This was never a disappearance that faded naturally. It was a disappearance that stayed active because too many details refused to disappear with it. Every few years, something new surfaced. A witness remembering another detail. A new forensic technique. Another search warrant. Another excavation. Another reminder that investigators still believed the truth had not been fully uncovered. That persistence changed how people viewed the case. Because most unsolved disappearances slowly lose momentum. Kristin's never really did. The Smart family made sure of that. For decades, they kept speaking publicly, kept pushing investigators, kept forcing media attention back toward the case. That level of persistence matters more than people realize. Because public pressure influences resources. Resources influence investigations. And investigations only survive decades if someone refuses to let them die. The Smart family refused. That refusal may ultimately be why the case reached conviction at all. But even now, after court rulings and sentencing, the emotional center of the case remains the same. Where is Kristin? That question still hangs over everything. Because no matter how strong the prosecution's theory became, there is still no confirmed recovery. No official burial site. No location the family can visit and finally say, "She's here." That absence leaves the case emotionally open. And emotionally open cases continue haunting people long after legal proceedings end. Especially when the timeline feels so terrifyingly simple. A college student leaves a party. A man walks her home. She vanishes forever. That simplicity makes the case feel close. Understandable. Possible. It removes the distance people often rely on to emotionally separate themselves from true crime stories. This wasn't a secretive criminal underworld. It wasn't organized crime. It wasn't a stranger attack in some isolated place. It was campus life. Dorms, students, a short walk home. That normality is exactly what makes the story so disturbing. Because it reminds people how quickly ordinary life can fracture. One moment Kristin was at a party with friends. The next, she entered a timeline she never returned from. And for nearly 30 years, investigators tried to reconstruct what happened inside that missing stretch of time. The prosecution believes they largely succeeded. They argued Paul Flores attempted to assault Kristin while walking her home and killed her during the encounter. Then came concealment. Years of concealment, possibly involving help from others. That theory explains why the searches focused so intensely on family properties. Because investigators believed Kristin's remains were not simply hidden temporarily. They were protected. And protection requires ongoing decisions. That is another reason this case feels psychologically different from many others. The silence allegedly lasted decades. That means every year involved choice. Choice not to speak. Choice not to reveal locations. Choice to continue protecting the secret. That accumulated silence weighs heavily on public perception. Especially because Kristin's family spent those same decades searching. Waiting. Hopping. Watching every new search operation for signs that this might finally be the moment. And then came the recent forensic developments that reignited everything again. Reports describing renewed searches and soil analysis immediately exploded online. Because people following the case understood what renewed forensic attention means after this many years. Investigators believe there may still be something left to find. That possibility transformed the story once more. Suddenly, this wasn't only a historical conviction case. It became active again, current again, potentially unfinished again. And unfinished cases generate enormous emotional reaction, especially when the victim has already become symbolic in the public mind. Kristin Smart represents more than one missing person case now. She represents persistence. The idea that families should never stop pushing. The idea that time should not erase accountability. And perhaps most importantly, the idea that buried truth can still surface decades later. That belief matters because cold cases depend on it. Without hope of eventual discovery, investigations collapse emotionally. But cases like Kristin's prove something important. Time damages evidence, but it also weakens silence. Witnesses age. Relationships change. Fear evolves. And eventually, secrets that once felt impossible to expose begin cracking under pressure. That may be the real story behind the Kristin Smart case. Not only what happened in 1996, but how difficult it became to keep the secret buried afterward. Because in the end, the pressure never disappeared. It only grew. Until eventually, investigators came back with warrants. Back with forensic teams. Back with modern science. Back with enough accumulated evidence to finally bring the case into court. And even now, many believe investigators are still searching for the final missing piece. The place where Kristin truly rests. Because only that discovery can finally transform this case from legally resolved to emotionally complete. In the end, the Kristin Smart case is not remembered because it was the most complicated investigation in America. It is remembered because it became one of the most frustrating. A case where suspicion existed almost immediately. A case where people believed they understood what happened long before they could legally prove it. And a case where time itself became part of the crime. Because every passing year deepened the wound. For Kristin's family. For investigators. For everyone who watched the case remain unresolved decade after decade. That is what makes this story different. Not only the disappearance, the waiting afterward, the birthdays without answers, the holidays interrupted by uncertainty, the endless cycle of hope every time investigators returned with another search warrant. That kind of grief changes shape over time. At first, families search for survival. Then they search for truth. Eventually, they search simply to bring someone home. And after nearly 30 years, that final goal still remains unfinished in the Kristin Smart case. The conviction established legal accountability. It told the world the justice system no longer viewed Kristin as a runaway or a mystery. It acknowledged murder. It acknowledged responsibility. But it did not restore what was taken. And it did not answer the one question that still matters most emotionally. Where is Kristin Smart? That question continues haunting this case because human beings need endings. Not legal endings. Human endings. A place. A grave. A final goodbye. Without that, part of the story remains suspended forever. That is why every new search connected to this case captures national attention instantly. People understand what those searches really represent. Not curiosity. Hope. Hope that after decades of silence, investigators may still uncover the final truth. And the terrifying reality is this. They may still believe that truth has been hidden all along. Perhaps moved. Perhaps concealed carefully over time. Perhaps protected by years of fear and silence. That possibility is what gives the case its darkest psychological dimension. Because if remains were relocated years later, then the concealment became ongoing. Deliberate. Sustained across decades. And sustained silence requires choices. Repeated choices. That idea disturbs people deeply. Not because it feels cinematic. Because it feels human. Fear. Protection. Loyalty. Denial. Those emotions can preserve secrets far longer than outsiders imagine. And in the Kristin Smart case, secrecy may have survived almost 30 years before the legal system